And so, since the year 2020 is officially over, there is one last thing we need to do. We need to make sure it is dead and buried. So, in order for that to happen, we need to go back and we need to cover every story of 2020 which we have skipped. Fortunately, we were really good at covering all the stories, so we only skipped 6 of them. Still, that is a lot of stories to go through. So in today's video, I will go through these stories extremely quickly, and I will only mention the important parts. With that said, there are 2 things which we will not be covering today. First of all, we will not be covering stories from the alternative universes, such as the Dark Star or the Pulsefire, because those would confuse people. And we will be skipping over the color stories connected to a champion's release. Usually, when a champion is revealed, they get their bio. This reveals who they are. But when they are released on live servers, they also get a color story. And that is a shorter story which points out what that champion is doing right now. Unfortunately, those stories don't move the lore forward. They are there just to set context, so we can safely skip them. There was only one exception to this rule, and that was Samira. Her color story actually did move the lore forward, and that was because she did tease Rel as a future champion. But as I said, that was an exception. So don't worry, you won't miss on anything by skipping those stories. But now, without further ado, let's have a look at all the stories of 2020 which we have not covered. 2020 started with some really good stories. We got the Dream Thief explaining what Lissandra is doing with the Iceborne. We got the Bow and the Kunai, which may be teasing a future champion. We got the Name of the Blade, explaining what is happening with Talon. The Axiomada, which really expanded the lore of Ishtal. Destiny and Fate, an amazing story tying what happened in the cinematic. After which we got all the Tales cinematics, with a Dark Star short story, but as I mentioned, we are skipping that. And then, in April, we are getting to the first story which we have skipped. And that is a story of Kennen, called Between Light and Shadows. In this story, we learned about some crucial parts of Kinko history. For example, because in the current times, Akali didn't pick up the mantle of the Fist of Shadow. The Triumvirate, which is the Kinko leadership, only had 2 leaders, Shen and Kennen. Shen's role as the Eye of Twilight was to deliver neutral viewpoints on all problems, with the Fist of Shadow delivering more of a realistic viewpoint. So these 2 together could make educated judgments. Kennen, being the Heart of the Tempest, was incredibly fast, and his job was called Coursing the Sun, which meant that he would deliver judgments of the leadership. In other words, he was a reliable messenger. But now, because there was no Fist of Shadow, Kennen helped Shen with the judgments. And in this story, he was delivering one of these judgments. He was traveling to Raishai in southern Zion. He traveled by a ship where he revealed some of his past. We learned that his master was the first Fist of Shadow, which was Tagasiri. Apparently, Kennen joined the Kinko centuries ago. But because he is the only Yordle among the Kinko, he is the only one who remembered those early times. And interestingly, while Yordles are immortal, because humans are mortal, Kennen believes that they are better at protecting balance, because they only have a limited time to push themselves to be better. And this may be one of the reasons why Kennen is a messenger. His judgment wouldn't be great, because it would be blurred by his endless past. That's why, interestingly enough, one of Kennen's hobbies is to remember the stories of humans. After all, the stories are all that's left behind. On this boat, we also learned that people in Ionia revere Yordles even in their natural form. So, unlike they do in Piltover, here, Yordles don't have to change shapes to hide. In Ionia, they are not in danger. Anyway, after a while, Kennen got to the Raishai temple, where he told the monks that they were unfit to protect the balance of Zion. It is true that they did obey the orders of the Kinko leadership, and they did not fight the Noxians even as their friends were slaughtered. So naturally the monks were surprised because they didn't know what was wrong with them. And that's where Kennen explained that their hearts were filled with hatred and dread. They didn't do anything, but they still hated the Noxians. And the local spirits were feeding on these emotions. What is interesting about this is that this story was released about 3 months before Yone, and here it is obviously already teasing the Azakana, which are the demons that are feeding on human emotions. So this story was just one massive teaser. At the end, Kennen fought some of the hateful acolytes and released the rest from the service to the Kinko. After this story, Riot released another story from the alternative universe. This time it was out of time for Pulsefire. Then we got the first part of the Sisterhood of War, after which we got another story which we skipped. This one is Kai'Sa's story, called Monstrous. Here we learned that Kai'Sa spends most of her time underground, rooting out the hiding buried Voidborn. One day she noticed that a village was built right above where she was currently fighting the monsters. And so she kidnapped one of the locals to bring him below the sands and show him the horrors hidden underneath their feet. Here we learned about an interesting detail. When Kai'Sa brings up her void mask over her face, her voice changes entirely and people can't understand her, so she can only speak to humans without a helm. Anyway, after Kai'Sa showed the man the Voidborn, she let him go in hopes that the villagers would get scared and they would flee. But once Kai'Sa climbed the surface to check the situation, she noticed the locals were getting ready to fight instead. And Kai'Sa knew this wasn't a battle they could win. So she marched into the village, knowing that people thought she was a monster. And she asked the man why did they not run. Of course, the moment people realized who she was, they raised the alarm. And they told Kai'Sa that they thought that she was the one who brought the monsters with her. This was kinda true. Wherever Kai'Sa was, there were also the Voidborn. But what the locals didn't realize is that this was the case because Kai'Sa was where the Voidborn were to stop them, not the other way around. But that didn't matter to Kai'Sa. She didn't care if they thought she was a monster. So, after threatening her, she killed the man in a duel and destroyed all the empty buildings around her, just so she wouldn't harm anyone else. Because she just wanted the locals to get scared and run. It didn't matter if they were afraid of her or the Void. After this story, we got some lore for Freljord, with Trundle getting his new story, and we got a lot of world building around the Watchers, after which we learned about Rumble, and then the massive wave of Ionian stories started. Here we got a lot of new lore for Riven, the Sisterhood of War series continued, Yasuo got a new setup, Xayah and Rakan got a new story, and then Lilia was released, which was followed by the finale of the Sisterhood of War. And in the middle of it we got a story where Misfortune met Nautilus. Of course, this is when Spirit Blossom happened, and that entire series of stories was ended with Yone's release. Which brings us to the next story which we skipped. A story for Gwyn called Shield of Remembrance. In this story, on the orders of High Marshal Tiana Crownguard, Gwyn traveled to the Green Fang Mountains near the borders of Demacia. Here she was supposed to investigate a crime scene. On her journey she found a burning house, and after inspecting the ruins, it became clear that this was a family house. A woman lived here with a child. But in the ruins, Gwyn found a Shield of Remembrance, which was a small medal that was given to families after one of their family members died in the military. So the woman's husband likely died. On top of that, the place above the hearth, where people usually hang their shields, was empty. So someone obviously stole things from here. Later, Gwyn noticed tracks outside the house. One group of tracks was leading into the house, and another group was leading away from the house. Hoping that she would be able to catch up with the criminals, Gwyn started following the tracks. On this mission, Gwyn met up with her friend, a ranger called Dalin, who has a loyal hound called Rigby. Together they ran through the woods until they found a group of warriors covered in furs. They were so far away, there was only one way to catch up with them before they got over the borders. They had to fly. And thankfully, as the story revealed, with the help of Valor, Gwyn can actually fly just like she does in the game. Which really shows you how massive Valor is. After Gwyn got to them, we learned that these were the warriors of Skagorn, which was an independent nation placed somewhere to the east of Demacia, just like Arbormark, which we already know about. After some careful sneaking, Gwyn was able to take all 6 of these warriors down by non-lethal means, because she is professional. And as she was facing their leader, she was stopped after the kidnapped woman called Astra stepped forward and explained the situation. She wasn't kidnapped, she left her home with these warriors willingly, because in reality, she was a daughter of the Skagorn chieftain. She moved to Demacia a while ago, despite the fact that she had minor magical abilities. Her husband died in the capital city the day Silas broke out of the prison. And after that, because of her nature, the locals saw her as a witch. And over time, it became dangerous to stay here with her daughter. Later we learned that it wasn't her and these warriors who burned her house. The group of tracks leading to that place was actually the locals who were afraid of her. But thankfully, when they burned the place to the ground, no one was inside. The story ends after Quinn escorts these warriors to the borders and lets them go despite the law telling Quinn to capture all of them. But she let them go because she knew things weren't that simple in Demacia. And she wouldn't let the Mage Rebellion ruin Astra's life simply because people were afraid. At least, in exchange, the warriors showed Quinn a blind spot in the Demacian borders. It was a gap between the watchtowers which allowed them to sneak in. So, after they left, Quinn ordered for another watchtower to be built in that place. After this story, Riot blessed us with some Sona lore. And then we learned about the giant statues of Ionia in the story of Master Yi. Then KDA happened, Samira was released, after which we got another story which we had to skip. And that was the story of Elise, called the Shattered Men's. Even though this story is quite long, the story is very simple. There was a renowned Shuriman thief who was hired to steal an artifact from the mansion of the Zavan family. For a while, he successfully explored the seemingly abandoned house, as he went from a library to library looking for the artifact. What he didn't know is that Elise was watching him the entire time. Here we learned that Elise has an excellent smell. She was able to smell the thief's origins, his skin color, and even where he had been. And later we learned that the thief was called Naim the Faceless. He was called the Faceless because he was born with his upper gum split from his lips to nose. Later, when he stole enough money, he paid a doctor to sew the cut in his upper lip together, so he would look normal. Eventually, he found the artifact, which was an hourglass filled with crimson blood-like substance. It filled his mind with gory thoughts. A slaughterman's cleaver splitting bone for the pot. Butchered corpses hung on hooks to drain them of blood. A toothed maw feeding a hunger that could never be sated. Soul lights ripped from the living and the dead. After finding the artifact, Elise revealed herself, and the two had a short conversation about Naim's chances of his survival. Then Naim tried to run, but he accidentally cracked the hourglass. A smoke started pouring out of the cracks. It was getting thicker and thicker, until it morphed into a creature covered in plates of rusted and decaying armor, with a horned skull on top of its body. Elise explained that this was a Soul Gorger, a monster of the Shadow Isles. And it was so powerful, Elise suggested the two would fight it together. Here we also learn that Naim carried a blade he stole from a tomb of an Ascended warrior, which means that he was holding a weapon of the Ascended. As the two fought the monster, the Soul Gorger stabbed Naim's arm. Elise knew this wound would eventually kill Naim. There was no way around it. A simple touch of the Shadow Isles drained life away. But she also knew that the Soul Gorger would get stronger after it killed a person. So, to keep Naim alive, and to keep the Soul Gorger from getting stronger, Elise bit Naim with her own poison, which prolonged his life. Eventually, after working together, the two managed to banish the monster back into the hourglass, after Naim distracted the monster, and Elise used her webs to seal the cracks in the hourglass. The story ends with Elise meeting LeBlanc. LeBlanc asked her if she managed to get the Soul Gorger for her, and Elise nodded, giving her a skull which was tightly sealed with her webs. It pulsed with crimson lights, which revealed that this skull was the Soul Gorger's new vessel. The twist at the end was that this skull had a mild deformity. Its upper gum had a crack in it, meaning that Elise didn't really care about Naim, and she just let him die from the corrupting wound. After this story we learned more about Udyr, Ziggs, Seraphine was revealed, and then for Halloween we got the creepiest story ever, and I really mean that. I had so much fun making a video on that. And then we learned about what it was like when Swain returned to Noxus. After everything that happened in Ionia, we learned about what Vladimir is doing in Noxus. And the year couldn't be ended with a better story. The story of Gragas. But right before that, there was the last story which we have skipped. And that was the story of Lysandra, called Hero of the Frost Moon. Here we learned that in her private chamber, Lysandra keeps the bodies of all the Iceborn she can find entombed in crystals. Of course, these crystals are the Black Ice. This also explains what happens to all the Iceborn she captures. In the story called Dreaming Thief, which was released at the beginning of that year, we learned that Lysandra is luring the Iceborn towards the Abyss. But we didn't really learn why. Well, that's what this story answers. These Iceborn locked in the crystals were half dead and half dreaming. So as Lysandra walked around them, we could see a Troll King's eyes following her around. When Lysandra approaches these crystal tombs, together the Iceborn inside start chanting "Kill the Ice Witch," because they all dream about the moment they killed the said Ice Witch. Moments later, somehow an intruder called Marjan managed to get into her chamber. She demanded Lysandra to release her sister. The sister's name was Hara, from the Caravanserai of Gilded Scarabs, which means that they were from Shurima, specifically the Great Sigh. And she dreamed of 800 years of ice unless she slew the Prophetess of Frost. The dagger Marjan carried emitted warmth, and it reeked of familiar hard-headed magic. Lysandra realized it was forged by an older spirit whose name she erased from Freljord's memory. And so she told Marjan she would release her sister in exchange for this dagger. But before Marjan was able to agree to this deal, her sister shouted from the tomb, "Kill the Ice Witch." And without hesitation, Marjan threw the dagger and buried it in Lysandra's chest. Then, after the crystal tomb melted, she picked up her sister and tried to run. But she didn't get too far before realizing that this was all a trick. She looked where Lysandra's body was supposed to lie, and saw nothing but a layer of fresh snow. She realized she never even threw the knife. She then looked up, and instead of the frost moon above, she saw Lysandra's grin. Moments later, Marjan, embracing her sister, found herself in a fresh tomb. Lysandra sensed that this family reunion was strong, powerful enough for Lysandra to taste the satisfaction they would bring to the monsters below. The illusion cast by the dreams of the sisters projected through the ice would keep the beasts slumbering a little longer. Lulling monsters to sleep was an exhausting job, but that night, Lysandra too could rest, for the hero protects the fragile world just a little bit longer. So yes, Lysandra is capturing the Iceborn, so she could essentially harvest their dreams and feed them to the Watchers, who then start dreaming about what the mortals are dreaming about. And that keeps them asleep. But that is it for the year of 2020. There is something magical about the year starting with Set, one of the most successful champion releases, and ending with Gragas, one of the most anticipated stories, even though nothing really happened in it. I'm just glad Gragas got a story. But either way, 2020 was a very successful year when it comes to the lore of League of Legends. We learned a lot, the stories moved forward, and we are not even done yet. We already know there is quite a few new things to dive into. But throughout all of this, I just keep thinking I forgot about something.